Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is our April edition of Probing the Literature. So National Journal Club kind of collaboration between ACEP and SAEM with a lot of people that got together thinking that we should have more opportunities to talk about how to do research, excellent POCUS articles, and how, as a fellow, you think about starting into this research journey and designing research articles. So this is IVC month. And so we're going to have two pretty different articles, both looking at ways in which you can use POCUS IVC or volume assessment to do research in various clinical settings. So this month, we're doing things a little bit differently. We have two author presentations, which is so exciting. Both authors are very excited to talk about their work, and how can we say no? That sounds fabulous. So we're going to start with Dr. Mike Blaivas, and I think a lot of you probably already know him, but Mike wears a ton of hats. He combines his clinical skills with his background in computer science and engineering to produce pretty prolific types of papers, a lot of them focused on machine learning and AI in POCUS. He's an incredible model for how to promote industry-academia collaborations, and he's the CMO of many companies, including ThinkSeno and Autonomous, but I think that actually there's a lot more, and I don't want to say ones that are wrong or outdated, but there's quite a few on that list. He's also a deputy editor at JUM and a professor at University of South Carolina School of Medicine. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining. We are going to be talking today about his article, Artificial Intelligence versus Expert, a comparison of rapid visual IVC collapsibility assessment between POCUS experts and a deep learning algorithm that he created. So we'll have Mike give us a bit of a chat, and then we'll have time for questions. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks, everyone, for being here and listening. I do have a couple of disclosures. As Nicole suggested, I'm a part-time CMO of Autonomous Medical Technologies and ThinkSeno. Those are the most relevant. They don't really, I won't be discussing their products here or anything like that. So, and this is the article in question. This one we put out in 2020. But the thoughts behind it actually start a little bit earlier. So today what I'd like to do is discuss what prompted this research study, because if there are a lot of fellows on, it's kind of helpful to understand how some ideas come to be and also how they keep rolling on, and you can do different slight adjustments to them or even turn them over completely, but yet still follow during or the same concept. We're going to talk about a little bit just about some foundational AI concepts. This isn't a 2-day lecture, so we can't dive in depth. And we're also going to talk, obviously, about the design of the study, the way the algorithm was put together and tested and trained, and then talk about some of the pitfalls and challenges of implementing AI research. We won't dwell on that a little bit, but this study kind of was a result of some of those challenges. So there's been considerable debate about the whole IVC concept. For me, it's kind of an interesting look backwards, because in approximately 2002, 2003, I was reading through the literature and came across some papers out of Japan by Japanese nephrologists who would estimate the dry weight in their dialysis patients by looking at their IVC, and actually were quite accurate, had good sensitivity and specificity. So this got me thinking, could this be applied to evaluating blood loss? Because I was at a level 1 trauma center at that time. We were getting a ton of patients. We were scanning all of them, but sometimes it was just a little unclear if they were really losing blood somewhere or not, even if the FAST exam was negative. And I thought, gosh, it'd be cool if we can detect as little as 500 cc's of blood lost acutely. No one had done that in the literature in emergency or point of care ultrasound that I knew of. And this is back when I actually knew every single article that had been published in the field. Those were easy days for readers and researchers. And what we did was we wanted to take a look at how accurate this, or how sensitive it could be. We were just trying to catch approximately 25% or so in IVC variation, and had two groups of patients. We decided to do this in kind of a neat way. We went to a blood bank nearby. But before we get to that detail, it's interesting because you can kind of pick the meta-analysis you want to support your claims. People seem to be on one side or the other. this whole IVC stuff is nonsense, or IVC really has something to it. Whether you're watching for complete collapse, 25%, some other ratio, etc. But my clinical experience had always been that it was very helpful for me. Obviously, people often look at applications in a vacuum and the potential impact of the IVC. But if you're a competent sonologist, you're going to be able to look at the lungs, you're going to be able to look at the heart. You've done your FAST exam, for instance. So you've already gathered, or you can gather after your IVC exam, a tremendous amount of information that really refines the data you get from your IVC assessment. There are basically always lots of issues with methodology with IVC, where how well are people really QAing their exams, or is the measurement in the same spot? There's even interest in looking at just the motion of the IVC, the two walls. There's some neat possibilities there I might touch on in a little bit. But my thought was, what this tells us is human eyes are simply not good enough. And I actually got to push that forward earlier with a company. I helped them design a pretty novel ultrasound device. And I said, you have to do 3 automated features. And one of them was auto IVC. And it was the first time that was ever done. That actually was quite helpful and fairly successful, I think. But really, I was just curious about the potential of AI and how to do it efficiently. So there are different ways you can approach this. You can look at collapsibility indexes, various ratios, as I mentioned. Typically, if you want to do this, you're going to be getting a cine loop, you're taking measurements, et cetera. And I was always a big fan of visual estimation, whether it's 50% collapse or 25%, and you're looking for fluid responsiveness, marker of hypovolemia or whatever, there's some data to back up any of those claims and any of those approaches. And again, with AI, given what we'll talk about in the next slide, I was really interested in doing something that's quite simple, partially because prior AI approaches were somewhat complex. One from the University of Michigan, for instance, I don't think that's up here, had a stacked algorithm system, I believe. They designed, it was very complicated. There was color Doppler used to basically do feature extraction, and then you pulled out the IVC. You did all sorts of calculations and measurements. It had to be done offline. So it was one of those great ideas, but you would get the results on your dying patient, at the end of the day. And as we all know from our clinical work, that's not so helpful. Others have used M mode tracings, and this is a neat thing. There's still some people that don't realize that your M mode cursor, unless it auto adjusts, is actually going to give you false information because of the respiration and the downward movement of the IVC. And that's one thing that I made sure this novel ultrasound product several years back with this big company took into account, so it's more accurate. And others created even yet different algorithms trying to pull out the IVC, such as in this paper. And there's probably another 4 or 5 that I just didn't want to include. But basically, most people calculate various measurements or get measurements and then calculate. I was interested in trying to match what a really good expert could do, which is do visual estimation. Because with thousands and thousands of scans, I felt like I could just eyeball an IVC, kind of like I could eyeball a left ventricle and say, the ejection fraction is the following, the degree of collapse is the following. And where that's useful is in a very critical situation. On the AI side, if I could do this, I wanted to make sure it was computationally very cheap. In other words, it didn't require a huge processor, and it could be done on the edge, meaning computing or calculation, whatever, at the point of contact. Well, with your device, it doesn't have to go to the cloud or to the back room or anything like that. And if you can't do on-edge applications, you're going to suffer in emergency situations and critical type cases. And the other thing I wanted to do is make sure it was something that actually could be made into a real product potentially and could simply work on a video feed, a live real-time video feed from any machine, or could be installed as a script. That was more theoretical. We didn't take it that far. So what did we do? We wanted to build this algorithm, and we decided we would have it identify and tell us if the IVC collapses less than 25% or more than 25%. And we would compare it to point of care experts doing the same thing. We ended up using a fairly computationally efficient algorithm called VGG16. It's a shallow algorithm. It's fairly old. It's 16 layers deep. It's just not in vogue right now with any cutting edge, facial recognition designer, et cetera, because it's not 1,000 levels deep, but we don't need it to be so deep. In fact, we've done work on my end looking at the performance of different algorithms, and it turns out some of the biggest and most complex ones do poorly with B mode ultrasound, partially because another study we did showed that there's just not that much difference from pixel to pixel. Whereas if you look at a life scene, someone riding on a bicycle down the street, there's so much difference from pixel to pixel, so much context. And as detractors of ultrasound will often make fun of us. Oh, you're looking at pea soup. Well, it turns out mathematically, it kind of is pea soup as far as that richness of texture, color, variation, et cetera. That's probably a talk for another time. And in the past, this was only used for image classification. That's basically, is this a cat, dog, car, et cetera? For us, it could be, and we actually use it this way, is this liver, is this a lung, heart, bladder, what have you? And it did a great job. But how do you get it to visually estimate what the IVC is doing? It turns out you have to embed it into another network. And we chose something called long short-term memory. And as it kind of suggests, you basically keep track, or there's memory in this system. So what you can do is keep track of changes from image to image. And it was actually designed for ESPN and others, so they can kind of automatically identify, okay, that's a touchdown. This is a basketball player going up to shoot. This is somebody weightlifting, et cetera. And I think at this point, I don't remember if anybody's used it for dynamic ultrasound. I didn't see that at the time. We decided to adapt it and just see if it would work. We did want real patient videos. I couldn't get my hands on some videos, and it was hard. I was going to go through the IRB process, et cetera. But then I thought, gosh, this is a common issue for point of care AI building. People don't have videos. So what we decided to try is another kind of novel pursuit at that time. We found IVC videos from public domain. This is on YouTube, everywhere else we can pull these off of, and got about 220 IVC videos. As you can imagine, they varied a lot. I think we probably had 20 plus different machines. Some I couldn't even figure out what they were. A lot of the quality was so-so, but we decided to use those. We split up the total data set, 80% for training, 20% for cross-validation. And what I did is I actually looked at every single one of those videos using DICOM software and measured the degree of collapse of the IVC at the same point. It was a little bit painful, but it made for tremendous accuracy. And that way I had labeled data to train on. And it's not a huge amount of data. So what we had to do was augment it a little bit. And what augmentation in this case refers is flipping your videos. And so you can flip them front to back. You can put them upside down, 45 degrees. And it turns out these are all legitimate methods and fairly well tested. Sometimes in our experience, sometimes this helps, sometimes it doesn't. I think in this particular instance, it did increase algorithm performance, and it increased our data from, let's say, 220 videos to, I think, the way we augmented to 4,000 or 5,000. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something that was fairly helpful. Now, once we trained our algorithm and optimized it, there are a lot of different settings you adjust, batch size, lots of neat terms. But bottom line is, it takes a while to optimize it, and you have to keep testing it over and over. But what we did then is we acquired 50 new videos from the same source, the internet, basically, public domain. They were all different from the ones before. By this point, several months had gone by, and we actually were able to find another 50 new videos, and use that as our predict set, or our test data set. And the AI algorithm got this and 3 POCUS experts got them. The POCUS experts were asked to not go back and forth, not use a ruler, and really treat this as a critically ill patient. You're looking at this IVC. What do you think? I think we did let them play it multiple times, but just asked them not to scroll back and forth to make it more realistic. The experts also rated the quality of the videos, and they were okay. Some were more difficult to interpret than others, but the experts, I think, rated every single video, and the algorithm also rated every single video successfully. The experts had good agreement with each other, very good agreement, cap of 0.65. The algorithm did not agree with the experts quite as well as I had hoped, and you can imagine why. There was a good agreement with 0.45 for the kappa. But the algorithm was able to analyze all the videos. It's interesting, it took the final training of the algorithm took 9.5 hours on the particular machine we had set up, but only 30 seconds to go through all 50 videos. So this gives you the idea that this is something that can run on the edge. This is an algorithm that can prospectively analyze your video while your video is running. Now, one thing I mentioned is this long short-term memory. You can have it look in the future a few frames, but also backwards. And that's something we did. We had it look forward and backwards to compare differences in the scenes, so it could pick out if there's some sort of a difference and obviously associated with an outcome. And we've had even better success since that time, expanding the number of frames in the future and in the past that it can compare. This does affect just how immediate the results are. So probably it's not going to be quite in real time, such as other algorithms. Let's say YOLO V8 or whatever that's the newest one for YOLO. This would probably be delayed by a second or so it can acquire enough frames in real life. So it's not a huge difference. So some interesting points out of this, for me anyway. There really is, and especially was at that time, a significant shortage of available data for anybody doing AI and POCUS. In fact, almost nothing existed. One of the studies we had to do borrowing a database of cardiac echoes from Stanford, from one of their studies, and all of them were postage stamp size. They were like 100 pixels by 100, but it was the only thing available that we could use for a POCUS study, and we adapted it and actually had to even rotate some of the views to generate parasternal images, or actually subxiphoid images, because they only had parasternal and apical. But it was a good proof of concept of using the public domain approach. You can only scale that so much, although obviously other applications may have more videos available online, and we are starting to see some data repositories come on, which is great. But I think one of the neat things, and this generated several articles that kind of came out of this research, was this this question of correlating, visual assessment or movement of the IVC potentially to other things. And we've looked at sepsis, severe dehydration, et cetera. And this is a real potential approach. And computationally, it's probably cheaper than doing measurements. Now, measurements are easy because you don't have the AI do the measurements. Typically, you just have an algorithm pick out or identify certain landmarks, and then you hard code dropping calipers. So that can happen very quickly. But this is still a fairly provocative approach at that time. And I'm not sure anybody's taken up on that very much, at least in the IVC realm. When there's no measurements, this can be simpler and faster, and that was our goal. And it did propel us to doing some further work. And even looking at the downsides of looking at the IVC in a data set that you didn't train on. And this happened to be going from adults to children. And the images to me looked very similar, except obviously the measurements were slightly different, but yet one algorithm could not cross over to the other data set. So in conclusion, we did have good agreement with POCUS experts for this AI algorithm. There's no doubt if we had, instead of 20 different machines, one machine, the AI algorithm will do better, much better. And I can talk about that a little bit. Well, we were, for 20 machines, we were probably like 1,000 patients shy of what we really needed to do. But the design was simple, both study and the AI algorithm and the approach. And turned out fairly well. The other neat thing is we performed it in-house, not in a large lab, not partnering with engineering folks, just did it ourselves, and got to explore a completely novel AI algorithm design and application at that time. And hopefully, keep glancing at my phone. Hopefully, that gives us enough time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. That is awesome. There are so many things that I love about this study, and I always have more questions. Some of them are not totally relevant to this, but there's always things to talk about. So I'm going to let other people go first, though. And I see there is a question from Derek in the chat. Derek wants to know how you were able to validate that the videos obtained from the public domain were unique from each other. It's a great question. I'm sure they were, but it's possible that you could have similar IVC videos posted on different sites. That's a great question. So when you're using public data repositories or public data from different sites, how do you kind of verify the data is unique and should be used kind of collectively in your training set?
So the most obvious would be look at the domain names, et cetera, basically compare the addresses, the internet addresses. But the problem is, as I think you kind of pointed out, that doesn't mean that somebody didn't upload the same video. So I had to do it visually. Luckily, it was just 220, and then I compared 50 against that. So there's several issues there. For the final 50, they're all newer because I basically went by date. A lot of times you can see date on the machine, the way people posted it. I still had to go back and compare. There were no duplicates in the final, but there were multiple duplicates before I called the duplicates, and I even had some triplicates as well. So that was part of the pain of cleaning your data. If you don't, you risk overfitting, which is bad for the algorithm's performance, but you also risk biasing the outcome, because if your algorithm has seen that data before, it's almost certainly going to perform very well on that same video again.
Awesome.
Thank you.
August, you also had a question. Do you want to ask Mike your question?
Just in the interest of learning how quickly the machines are coming for us, when you did your sort of perfect DICOM measurements, who agreed better with kind of your gold standard, the other experts, the human experts, or the algorithm?
I can't remember. The experts didn't do quite as well as I'd hoped, so I kind of buried that. I didn't write about it in the paper. I never talked to, these are all friends and stuff and colleagues. I actually never brought it up, but they, and, it's not that they sucked, but they weren't as perfect as I thought they would. And I could see why, because the measurements were just maddening to do. And sometimes it was a matter of a couple of millimeters. And halfway through, I was thinking, oh my gosh, maybe this wasn't a good idea.
Awesome. Raymond is asking about why you picked the cutoff of 25% collapsibility instead of 50. Any considerations about going back and retraining on 50?
You could quite easily. I'd probably go for a better data set. I think at that time we were about to do a study with Brown, and it was NIH funded, and 25 was the key marker for that. So it made sense. But 50 is, in a way, is a much lower hanging fruit in terms of almost certainly impactful.
That makes a lot of sense. And then kind of piggybacking on that question, I wondered why, I understand as a first use case, you would want to compare it to expert assessment, but the clinical use I see for this, or one of the utilities, is that you can actually, novices would be able to use this. So somebody who doesn't already kind of do their own assessments visually, not that experts don't need it, because obviously there's quite a lot of variability with the expert interpretations as well. But I see kind of a lower threshold for novices adopting some of this technology, just because they feel so much less comfortable doing these assessments on their own. So any thoughts about kind of retesting this and doing sort of a model novice expert head-to-head comparison and seeing kind of how the model interpretation compares to novice interpretation?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And one of the things I wrote about in the paper is that this really would be meant for novices, but I wanted to test it against experts, because you can't kind of skip the expert step. Otherwise, everyone will accuse you of, this is useful for novices, or you're better than a novice, but what about the experts? So this was it was a quick, fun study to do, and I can't remember if that was the first time we embedded one algorithm or in another. So the technical aspects were reasonably challenging. So that took up a lot of the work, and the rest almost had to be simple to make it quick.
Definitely.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in kind of with a question, but also a comment. We're kind of milling through this huge AI fast exam study that we've finished up, and we're having the exact same problem where like our experts are so unreliable, and like myself and some of my fellows in the room included, where like they just can't come up with this ground truth. And it's kind of a question of like, what is the minimally competent image actually? And how we come up with that probably has to come from large data sets and scoring as well, because I just can't come up with a reasonable scoring infrastructure. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, I think one thing right away you start out with, can you really get ground truth from fast exams? Because obviously it's not the same as a DPL, somebody going in there, or really the true criterion standard is CT. So it would be provocative to train your algorithm on fast exams with a CT outcome tied to it, and then test it more prospectively against fellows and experts and novices and see how it performed, because you never know what the AI is picking up. So I think one of the first challenges, is the ground truth really ground truth, and then you can get into debates about that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then also like what's clinically useful versus what an expert thinks is perfect. We'll never kind of settle on that. So
Absolutely. Now I guess you can go for classic. We had to do this on the commercial end, getting the perfect view of the heart, and then training an algorithm with increasingly abnormal images from the central plane going through a apical four chamber. And you can actually do that. It does require a lot of curation and a lot of work. And that was done based on individual still frames. There could be other approaches now.
Yeah. That's super interesting. And it's kind of related to another concept that I feel like I keep running into when trying to get these studies funded by like federal entities, is like this research is just not along the same lines as traditional research. So even something as seemingly simple as like a power calculation, those methods don't really exist for creating AI studies. Like, how do you know how big your cohort needs to be, right? And so I just think that the concepts of how you design and conduct a research study when you're creating models like this is going to have to expand. And I think it is, but it's just slow to change. And that's similar to like, how do you create ground truth, right? For like things like CT or MRI, it's a little bit more simple, but for things like POCUS, it's a different beast altogether. So those are great.
And if your power calculations for still images, CNAs, patient encounters, normal, abnormal, so it's so complicated.
Mm-hmm. I think we're almost out of time. Justine has a great question to end on. So this is a question we kind of were talking about at the beginning, and it's something I get asked a lot. But as a new fellow who is very interested in getting into the space, are there any kind of quick references that you would recommend to kind of understand more about these technologies and learn more about the data science of getting involved in studies like this?
So the best and most painful would be actually take a class, like one of those Stanford spin-off classes that'll in 4 or 5 months guide you through building your own algorithm, training it for image identification. It's probably going to be flowers or cars or something like that, troubleshooting it, and then having it do a predict. That's a deeper dive, but that'll get you the best understanding. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to dig into some kind of technical description of how to build algorithms, how they work. Because when I first got interested in the topic, I read hundreds of papers, mostly from radiology. And then I ended up going through 4 textbooks on machine learning, trying to remember calculus, et cetera. And I still found that I could not describe the process of how to go from A to Z to a fellow or a resident. It drove me bonkers. So then I actually started taking the real courses and doing the design. And I was like, wow, this is totally different. And there's no magic about it. It's just like really stupid math, but repeated so many times that it seems smart.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a common problem that we're coming up against. And I think we're going to have some better and kind of more streamlined resources. I know there's lots more questions. I'm so sorry, but we're out of time on this one, and I want to move to the second article. So Mike, thank you so much.
Feel free to email me, anyone too, with questions.
Awesome. Yeah,
Thank you,
guys,
Nicole.
let's keep the
Thanks, everyone.
conversation going. I really appreciate you joining. We're going to be moving to the second article, a little bit different than this first. So we've got two authors actually here for the second article. We've got Matt Riscinti and August Longino. So Matt, probably many of you know, he's both the emergency ultrasound director and fellowship director at Denver Health. His academic focus is on deep learning and teleguidance augmentation for ultrasound education and design thinking in med ed. He focuses a lot of his time on creating amazing med ed resources for all of us to use that I'm sure we all have over our time. He's the co-founder and lead editor of POCUS Atlas, among many other high yield foam resources. And then August Longino is here with us. He's the first author. He's an IM resident at University of Colorado, did med school at UW, go Huskies. And he is interested in academic career in cardiology or ICU, doing clinical research on sepsis and volume assessment, which is perfect because this is an excellent example of kind of interdisciplinary intersection between POCUS concepts and research collaboration. So I love this team. We're going to be talking about their very, very recent article in Chest about prospectively validating the Vexus for looking at venous congestion. So sorry for the delay, August, but I'll let you take over.
Yeah, and thanks for having us last minute also, Nicole.
No, thank you. Oh, I think you're muted, August.
There we go.
There you go.
My computer is too fancy. It like moves bars around trying to help. All right. So thank you guys so much for having me and Matt here. And thank you for that lovely intro. I will just say that this is a significant step down from Dr. Blaivas. So I am not presenting from such lofty heights. I'm just an IM resident who is interested in ultrasound stuff and kind of moving the field forward. So
Hey, as you are modest as always, can you share the grant that you acquired to perform this research and talk about that?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So my understanding is like a lot of you guys are fellows interested in research. The context for this project was that I got a training grant called the R38, which is an NIH year-long training grant that you can get in residency in internal medicine. Basically, the NIH buys out 90% of your time, and they give you like $28,000 to play with, which is like more money than I could ever conceive of for research. But all my senior mentors were like, that is literally decimal dust and like, you know, a hilariously small amount of money. But we'll talk about that in just a second. So this is kind of this is what I got done, part of what I got done during that year. So today, I'd like to talk about kind of where I began and what not to do. The question that we ultimately ended up asking, basically, hey, can you get the same data out of an ultrasound that you can get out of a right heart cath? And we found that we could get pretty close. I want to talk about some next steps. I'm really excited about some of the things that have been said today on the call, and I want to talk about some new findings that we've developed since this article was published. And then I'll just reflect briefly on what I would do differently next time. So where it started, it was this very ambitious, complicated project. I was told, like, you have a year, you have funding, and I was pretty sure that I was going to discover the mechanism of microvascular dysregulation in sepsis and septic shock. And so I developed this huge research protocol that involved following patients from the emergency room through the whole hospital and collecting data points on what their capillaries looked like at multiple times in their hospitalization, and found that there were a lot of challenges involved in that study design. So sepsis is a hugely heterogeneous population. As you guys know, a sepsis alert goes out, everyone's got sepsis. And then by the time you actually get to the unit, you know, about 10% of those people probably have the underlying pathophysiology you care about. It was incredibly difficult to coordinate data collection on all these people. People were coming into the hospital times when I wasn't in the hospital. And so trying to get the research team to, you know, run my protocol was really challenging. And then finally, if you guys have ever worked with an IRB before, there were a lot of ethical hurdles involved in trying to do research on people who came in, you know, with altered mental status and unable to consent to you doing all these study procedures on them in their sepsis. So ultimately what I decided was I should study something else. And so this took me a little bit of time to come to, but I decided to pivot. And in talking about pivoting, I think this is an important skill for us junior researchers to develop. And I think that the first thing to think about when you're trying to pivot your research is what part of what you're doing now is working. And in my case, what I had found myself drawn to was one of the data points we were collecting was the use of VEXIS or ultrasound to look at people's volume status. That was like one data point we were collecting in this larger study of sepsis. It's important to keep your momentum. So I was recruiting all these patients, and I had data on all of them for this VEXIS, kind of question. And I was able to pretty seamlessly kind of say, this is the part I want to focus on, and I'm going to keep going in that direction. And then finally, find new friends, find new mentors if you want to change the question you're asking. So in this case, I was working with a big shot sepsis researcher at Denver Health. And then I reached out to a few other people, including Matt Riscinti, who helped me kind of develop this new idea. You guys may have seen this box before, but when thinking about a project that you're trying to conceive of, this is kind of how I like to frame it. And so you can think of any project you can conceive of can be plotted on two axes: how much effort and how much impact it's going to result in. So first of all, you got your low effort, low impact projects. Those are case reports. No one cares about them, and you shouldn't spend your time on them. Then you got high effort, high impact. That's Dr. Blaivas, right? That's for later in your career. Then there's high effort, low impact. This is when someone else asks you to do chart entry for their first author paper. Do not do this project. I have found that as a trainee, I try to spend most of my time in this low effort, high impact box. And that is what I think I was able to do here. So the question that I pivoted to was, for these septic patients, we kept on talking about their volume status, their volume status, their volume status. And, as a resident, I asked, what is volume status? And I found out that volume status, if you ask that question, it's a pretty big can of worms. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And so I thought, maybe we can ask some better questions. So first of all, the question that we often ask is, would fluid help my patient? We call that fluid responsiveness. But I think a more germane question in the sepsis literature and in heart failure and a lot of different pathologies that we encounter is fluid hurting my patient? The question of fluid tolerance. And while we have lots of ways to measure fluid responsiveness, that's kind of the paradigm that we exist in now, it's a little bit harder to figure out whether your patient is fluid tolerant or not. So how can we measure this? So, when we really want to know the answer, when we're tired of looking at neck veins and we're tired of looking at people's lower extremities and, we are not sure what to do with the IVC, we get a right heart cath. And you guys might remember this, so a right heart cath is this invasive procedure that we do. We take a little pressure transducer, we put it into your neck, we float it down into your right atrium where we detect the pressure. And if it's over 10, we say you're volume overloaded and you could probably benefit from diuresis. If it's less than 7, you're dry, you might benefit from some fluid. Then we keep moving that probe. So we go down into the RV, we go up into the PA, where we measure a mean pulmonary arterial pressure. This is another measurement that people often use to talk about volume overloaded states or patients with pulmonary hypertension. And then finally, a wedge pressure, which we think of as being sort of emblematic of left-sided pressures. So there's some pros to this approach. So this is the definitive measurement. When you really want to know the answer, this is what you get. There are also some cons. So it's resource intensive. You got to have a cath lab. Someone's got to pay a cardiologist to do something. It's invasive and carries some risks to the patient. And it's time consuming. You can't do this at the bedside. So we need something new. And in 2020, some very smart Canadians came up with the answer. So they came up with this thing, a 4-point ultrasound exam. They said you can do basically this 4-point ultrasound protocol where you look at the IVC, the liver, the kidneys. And we think that you can use this as a non-invasive means of determining venous congestion or volume overload. And so this is their sort of landmark paper, which came out in the Ultrasound Journal. It came out in 2020, and they had some really astounding findings. So they said venous excess ultrasound, or VEXIS, graded on a scale of 0 through 3. If your VEXIS grade is 3, then we can predict that you have a positive likelihood ratio of 6.5 for AKI, cardiorenal AKI in this case. And they found that this outperformed central venous pressure measurements. And so the conclusion from this paper was, could this be an easy, non-invasive technique that might be better than right heart cath? So we wanted to figure that out because we found out that between 2020 and 2022, no one had done any sort of validation, which was baffling to me. And I had this year to kill. And so I wanted to figure out, can we validate this tool for use in future studies? So we figured the gold standard for this stuff is right heart cath, and so we should compare Vexus to right heart cath. That should be our base case, our base truth. And so compared Vexus grade to intracardiac pressures as measured by right heart cath, biomarkers, and a couple clinical outcomes we'll talk about. And I want to highlight that the methods here are so much easier. Like, you have a cath lab, you have patients going into a cath lab, you consent them, you scan them, they go for their procedure, and you enter some data into REDCap. And then you do math, and then you publish a paper. Nice and bite-sized. So what we ended up doing is we screened about 100 patients, and after, for various reasons, people got excluded, we ended up with about 80 of them left. And this was what we found. So on the left, you can see these nice violin plots, where you have your Vexus grade on the X and your right atrial pressure on the Y. This is kind of the thing that we're most familiar with looking at as the gold standard for venous congestion. And one thing that I actually thought was really interesting is the only difference in the Vexus between a grade of 0 and 1 is the size of your IVC, greater or less than 2. So one way to interpret this data is that the size of your IVC does not have much to do with what your right atrial pressure is. But regardless, we found that Vexus score seemed to correlate pretty well with your right atrial pressure. These are some AUC curves, or ROC curves, I should say, where we were trying to answer the question, basically, is Vexus better than IVC or IVC collapsibility for detecting a wet or a dry patient? And so what you can see here, and sometimes it's helpful to just go over what an ROC curve is, which I'll do briefly. So on the Y is sensitivity. So you want your test to be perfectly sensitive. So you want it to be all the way at the top of the Y-axis. And on the X-axis is 1 minus specificity. So it's a little confusing, but your perfectly specific test is all the way on the left of the X-axis. So your perfect test, which is super sensitive and super specific, is at the top left. And the parameter that we care about is the area under the curve, right? So it's everything below those dotted lines. And what we found, so if you look on the left, this is for detection of a dry patient, so someone with a right atrial pressure of less than 7, was that Vexus and IVC diameter both did decently well, and they were pretty close. And then the IVC collapsibility index, we used 50%, was a little bit less for detecting dry people. When we looked at wet patients, so people with a right atrial pressure over 10, Vexus did substantially better than IVC diameter or IVC collapsibility with non-overlapping confidence intervals. So we think that this is probably a better test than IVC alone for detecting your volume overloaded patients, which makes some sense, right? Because IVC is included in the Vexus exam. There we go. So we ran the same test looking at mean PA, and we found something similar. So there's a couple outliers on the graph on the left, but you can see that there's still a significant relationship between Vexus and mean PA pressure. And the same is true of the wedge pressure. So if your intracardiac filling pressures are high, your Vexus is high, even after you control for age and sex. And Charlson Comorbidity Index, which is kind of a laundry list of comorbid conditions. One of the most interesting analyses that we did that I think is a little bit underplayed in the article itself is that we looked at just patients who were admitted with heart failure, and we looked at their weight at the time of their Vexus score, and then we looked at their weight at the time of discharge. And we found that the greatest change in weight was associated with the greatest initial Vexus grade. So if your Vexus score was high, it suggested that you were able to undergo more diuresis or lose more weight over the course of your hospitalization, which was very exciting for us and led to some of the subsequent research that we'll talk about. So what's next is, I think, a really important question. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in subpopulations. So does this work in patients with tricuspid regurgitation, cirrhosis, or positive pressure ventilation? What about sepsis? There's a lot of different pathophysiological confounders for this exam. We took a look at patients in our data set just with tricuspid regurgitation, either moderate or severe. And we found that the relationships that we originally observed in our broad population persisted in folks with TR. So we think the redundancy of the Vexus exam makes up for some of the variability in the patient population. So it still works in TR. Another big question is, does this capture dynamic change? Does this technique, we said, okay, it reflects reflects right heart cath values at a static point in time. But what about patients who are getting fluid loaded or not? We have a paper under submission now that was looking at VEXUS grades in people, sort of an N of 1 pre-post study before and after people undergo hemodialysis. And we found that there was a significant decrease in VEXUS score following HD. People got, on average, about a liter taken off. But when that comes out in press, you guys can look it up. And then an important question is, the VEXUS score, it's got these 4 reviews. It's kind of time intensive. It's kind of labor intensive. How easy is it to get this into the hands of providers like yourselves? Like, can you actually do this test? And one thing that people always, have trouble with is the renal view. So student Dr. Martin, who's actually on this call, did a great analysis of our original data set, basically looking and saying, hey, what if we just take out the renal view and score it the exact same way? And what we found was that you don't really need the renal view. So what you can see here, so T VEXUS in this figure is the traditional VEXUS. M VEXUS is the modified VEXUS, that is to say, VEXUS without the renal view. And then IVC diameter is IVC diameter. And we found that T VEXUS and M VEXUS were pretty similar, so much so that we think you could probably get away without the renal view, which is great news. So this is under submission at the Ultrasound Journal right now. So we'll see if they like it. And then finally, we were talking about kind of, this is, comparing this to a right heart cath is all very well and good. But what about patients? And so this is a figure from a study that we haven't written up yet, looking at congestion scores or VEXUS scores in patients who are hospitalized with acute decompensated heart failure, and just looking at how their score changes as they get diuresed. And we see a significant change in VEXUS score as people get drier over time, which is very exciting to us. But there's still a lot left to do. So, I would like to know, how does this work in sepsis? What about your undifferentiated ED patient? How much can we learn about these people with ultrasound? And those questions are yet to be answered. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done by people like you guys to answer those questions. So my takeaways, things that I learned from my year that resulted in this research. Ask a simple question, use simple methods, use the infrastructure you have, find good mentors, and don't be afraid to pivot. So these are some of the people that helped me on this road. So Dr. Ira Douglas, Dr. Edward Gill, Dr. Joe Burke, and Dr. Riscinti, you guys know. Katie Martin's here on the call. Gabe Siegel, also on the call, listed here as an R3, now an ultrasound fellow. And then all the hospitalists that we constantly stole ultrasounds from, and all of our patients. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. August, this is just incredible. Thank you so much. I was just chatting with Dan before, saying that I've sent this article out to all of my team here, just because it's something that they must read as a really great clinical paper, and also really great example of how you conduct a meaningful research study. So truly incredible work. People probably have tons of questions. I know I do, but let's start with the chat. So Christopher wants to know, in regards to applying to the ED population, did you guys look at the time it took to perform the exams? I think I did see that in there, actually. Were the patients hemodynamically stable and able to take pauses and respirations to get reliable windows? That I don't know the answer to.
All right. Long answer. Short question, long answer. So I will say that I think that the time that we published, which is like 8 or 10 minutes or something, is artificially long because we were trying to get these like really nice images that could be included in a paper. Gabe, how long does it take you to do a VEXUS in the ED? Gabe Siegel may not be joining us. He might. So Gabe is our one of our ED collaborators. I might have stepped away.
Sorry, I'm on the call. Probably like, I think I've timed myself it's usually like between 4 to 5 minutes.
Yeah. And I would say that's kind of closer to clinical use, anecdotally, if you have a decent amount of, it probably goes, I think the learning curve goes from 10 minutes to 8 minutes over the first 10 or so that you do, and then very quickly you're into the sort of 4 to 5 minute window. And then your question was, were the patients hemodynamically stable, and could you get them to stop breathing? One of the things I really like about VEXUS is that you don't really need people to stop breathing. You can, one of the nice things about doing Doppler ultrasound of encapsulated organs, like the liver and the kidneys, is that they don't have as much respiratory variation as the IVC does. But in answer to your question, the vast majority of these patients were hemodynamically stable because they had to be stable enough to give consent and undergo right heart catheterization. So I think future studies will look at kind of these folks in extremis. The other thing that I will say on this note is we found that connecting an ECG lead to your ultrasound was really vital because you do see some variation with respiration in the Doppler waveforms. And so getting an EKG lead allows you to locate yourself in the cardiac cycle as opposed to the respiratory cycle. So you'll see variation, in some of the waves, and you want to know that that's due to the heart and not the lungs.
Excellent. Larry, I see your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, congratulations on an amazing study. I've been wondering why cardiology and nephrology are not getting more into the VEXAS game. Just as it was difficult for us with undifferentiated patients to replicate Daniel Lichtenstein's initial work in lung ultrasound, likewise with undifferentiated patients. It seems like people in the volume overload biz should be getting more and more into this and seeing what the advantages are. So I think there are far-reaching applications to what you're working on, and thank you for doing it.
Of course. I mean, I think you guys are way out ahead, right? Like of the everyone's an EM doc here, right? Except me. So like you guys are ahead of the internal medicine folks when it comes to integrating POCUS into the into the care that we provide. Cardiologists, of course, right? Try getting a POCUS paper into a cardiology conference. If it's not echo, they're way over it. And the nephrologists, of course, actually are fairly invested in this stuff. If you guys have a chance, you should Google nephro-POCUS if you're not familiar. There's plenty of uptake in the nephrology world. Among those of them that are not staffing DaVita clinics.
Or even better, how about Twitter nephro-POCUS? That'll get you even more.
Yeah.
Awesome. Raymond, I think, has a question as well.
Yeah, great question. So this question brings up something really important, which is that we didn't invent the VEXAS exam. So any work that we do, and whatever, when Dr. Blaivas patents the AI algorithm that reads VEXASs automatically, doctors Boban-Soligny, Corbin Haycock, and Philippe Rolla, among others, should really get the credit. I mean, they were these guys who wrote that initial paper back in 2020 are the VEXAS experts, not us. But Dr. Rolla has been an ongoing collaborator for us, and he reviewed about 10% of the study images to validate them. And so it was me and a couple of us reviewers just blindedly reviewing the images, but then having our work double checked by Dr. Rolla.
I wanted to add
just a quick methodologic question. Even if you feel like their objectivity is beyond reproach, the journal editors are going to want to see that you thought about it. So you always want to have at least a partial.
I was just going to add, there was a question about the ED patients. We're going to be doing research very soon that will be very much based in the ED and our OBS units to capture CHF patients. And then we haven't really discussed one-run dialysis, but he's already captured that data. And then the ED implementation of this is difficult, right? It is still hard to do even for ultrasound fellows and fellowship trained people. I love the research showing that the witchcraft view of the renal waveform may or may not be necessary. So more to come on that. Obviously, automation would be highly welcomed here. And if you look at some of the vendors' machines that can do automated LVOT VTI, that's harder for machine learning than some of these. So I think there's a lot of promise. And as we develop more AI algorithms, we can ask more complicated questions. We don't even know what questions we can ask yet. And I think this is an example where VEXAS will come into favor later.
Yeah, it's so funny because a lot of the contentious scans or the scans that people are very polarized about doing are often just the ones that we're bad at, right? And those are potentially the ones that machine learning would be great at. And so similar to like IVC collapsibility or being able to like spot check, certain cardiac measures on TTEs like Vexus, IVC, those are all things that AI would be great at. So like similar to what Blaivas was doing with the IVC collapsibility, I mean, this is super amenable to a model and to just giving you automated scores that are really, discrete and dichotomous. It would be a great tool that I think people would use in many different contexts.
For sure. For sure. And the other thing I lost my train of thought was August mentioned this, but I was one of the blinded reviewers of studies, and it is like nearly impossible to do without the EKG leads. So if you are all thinking about implementing Vexus in your ED care or like some sort of study, like just get the EKG leads for your machine if you don't have them already. We did not initially.
All right, we are almost out of time. Are there any last burning questions? This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate everybody's engagement. Nikolai, you have a question?
That was not a question. I was just on the top of my head was there's so much data within pulse wave Doppler waveforms that, if you feed that into machine learning with a model, that might give you kind of more features and more signatures that you just, you don't have time to do that analysis in real time.
Yeah, the vast amount of data is a blessing and a curse, I think.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I can't thank you both enough for joining us and to everybody for being engaged in the conversation. That concludes our author section of our April Journal Club. We are going to be transitioning to methods consult next. So if anybody, any fellows, any researchers, anybody really on the call, just has some burning questions about their research methods or they want to talk through a study, feel free to stay on the call and we can kind of walk you through that. But thank you so much again, guys. The next session will be in about a month from now, and Petra will send out announcements. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. The next session is going to be musculoskeletal and soft tissue on 5/21 at 2 p.m. EST, same time as our usual events. So I'm going to stop the recording and then open the floor for any further questions.